Today I want to talk about Bringer of Light by Frank W. Janus, and it is almost impossible to adequately describe this book. It is a sci-fi novel, but I would consider it sort of soft sci-fi. There's no space or aliens or anything like that. It all takes place on Earth, but it spans several centuries, thousands of years, multiple cultures over thousands of years. It's sort of a Jules Verne meets H.G. Wells meets Ayn Rand, although I would argue that Frank W. Janus is a far better storyteller than Ayn Rand. Even if you're not really into sci-fi, it reads almost like a fantasy novel, so if you're into sort of sci-fi fantasy or soft sci-fi or even fantasy novels, this might be something that you're into. If any of that sounds interesting to you, I will be giving away a copy of this book, so stay till the end to get that information. In the vein of full disclosure, this book was sent to me for free by the author in exchange for my fair and honest review, which is one of the reasons that I'm giving a copy away. It was something that I received at no cost to myself, and so I have offset the expense by giving a copy to someone else. I would like to go over the plot, but there will be a little bit of story spoiler in here, so if you're really sensitive to that sort of thing, you can always use the timestamp below to skip past the plot summary and go to the recap information. And of course, before we get going, I do have to do the YouTube thing and ask that if you would please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Things like that really help me out, so if you've already done it, thanks so much for taking the time. So the story spans thousands of years, but the bulk of it is contained within about 500 years. And we start out in the golden age of sailing. There is a ship carrying passengers from the Netherlands to the Dutch East Indies, and it is attacked by a blue glowing sea monster. A handful of passengers is washed overboard, and they find themselves washed up on its uncharted island, far off course from where they expected that they should be. The stars don't line up, and they slowly start to realize that none of them actually match any of the known star formations that they are familiar with, so they're having a hard time figuring out where in the world they are and how they got there. Over time, it becomes obvious that there is something more nefarious going on that island than simply being shipwrecked. Interlaced with that is a story that takes place several decades beyond that. So we are in Romania, just on the cusp of World War II, and there are these twin boys, one of which is quite simple. He has some brain damage due to something that happened during his birth, and then the other one is brilliant. Beyond brilliant. He is shaping up to become or grow into one of the greatest minds of their generation. We've got a brief but intense love affair between two strangers in the 1980s, a billionaire playboy in roughly current day, a hostile financial takeover between two behemoth companies in the early near future, and then finally a far futuristic, thousands of years in the future, idyllic society that is run by AI, and all disease is solved, all illness, all starvation, all housing crises, all economic crises, all global environmental crises look to have been solved. So all of humanity's problems have been taken away or resolved by this AI. Throughout the first half of the book, these stories seem unrelated. We're jumping from chapter to chapter, from time period to time period, without any real connectivity between them. After about the midway point, the author starts to slowly give you the pieces and the threads that you need in order to sort of weave the stories together and start making connections between them, between the people and what's happening and the way that this group is impacting the world here and this group is impacting the world here and why this caused this. And it's all done in a very slow unraveling, and it feels really good as you start to figure things out. The author gives you enough information to piece things together on your own before they are revealed, so it's very satisfying to read it. I did really enjoy reading this book, but that doesn't mean that it's without flaws. So let's talk about some things that could have been done better or didn't suit my personal tastes and why. There were some formatting or editing issues in the book, some typos or strange punctuation, a few places where a paragraph got cut and then continued, or there was like an extra paragraph inserted kind of halfway through. This is not particularly uncommon, especially with self-published or indie-published books, but if those sorts of things really bother you, they don't particularly bother me as long as the story is readable, and this certainly was. But if you're really sensitive and you expect a book to be perfect, none of them are, but if you're super sensitive to it, especially in the latter half of the book, there are quite a few of these, so just be aware of that going into it. There were times during the book or during the story where the dialogue felt kind of rough or robotic, or it didn't feel like a natural way that two people would talk to each other. It didn't detract from my enjoyment of it, but it was noticeable to the point that it pulled me out of the story just a little bit. So again, if you're really sensitive to dialogue and the dialogue has to be perfectly smooth and polished, just keep that in mind. The book is billed as a new scientific romance, and I was not sold on the romance part of it. While there were a few romantic interludes mentioned within the book, or brief romantic encounters, it certainly wasn't the prevalent part of the story, or a prevalent part of the story. It was more like, this is a thing that happened, let's move on. I don't feel like the romantic component in the book was substantial enough that I would label this as a scientific romance. None of the love encounters felt like a deep, abiding love, or rather, the only one that possibly could have wasn't the romance in the book. So that was a little strange to me. Most people don't read sci-fi or soft sci-fi or fantasy for the romantic subplots. Like, we're all aware that they're there, but that's not really why you read it. And it certainly didn't detract from the novel for me. But when something is billed or sold as a romance or a sci-fi romance, you expect the romantic part to be a reasonably prevalent part of the story, and it just wasn't. That was fine for me, but if you're looking for romance, this is not the right book. While I didn't feel like romance was a prevalent part of the book, I did feel like politics was. And I found at times that the author could be a bit heavy-handed. It seemed like the political soapboxing that was existing was meant to be a character trait or a character flaw, that those ideologies or those opinions were supposed to be something that the character was feeling or the way that the character believed, but the way that it was presented and the heavy-handedness of it and the almost being bludgeoned in the face with a hammer at times, that's why I sort of brought up Ayn Rand at the beginning, is because she is so heavy-handed in her political statements in the book, and this kind of whiffed of that a little bit. If that sort of thing really bothers you, this probably isn't going to be the right book for you. And again, I feel like it was an attempt at portraying two characters at odds with each other and using their opposing political ideologies sort of as a way to portray that they just had this one more thing that they just couldn't come to a middle ground because they were so vastly different. I think that was the effort that was being made, or that was the attempt that was being made, but I feel like it fell short. It felt more like the author soapboxing than the characters' mindsets. So romance was a very, very small part of the book. Politics was kind of low to medium input. It certainly played a role, but it wasn't what the book was about. The book was about the taking over of AI, of artificial intelligence, and as it sort of develops and becomes a more prevalent part in the everyday lives of human beings, and sort of how useful that can be at solving problems and fixing things that seem really complex to humans, but maybe not so much to machines. They can be taught to be, at least in theory, truly altruistic, truly the problem is human suffering, resolve the problem. Without personal motivation for things like greed and own comfort at the expense of others. So the main character, I don't want to say he's anti-AI, because he's not. He is anti-relinquishing control to machines, control of your life, control of your decision-making. So he has no problem implementing technology to the point that it is a useful tool. But when it crosses over into a decision-making apparatus, when the AI is making the choice rather than the human making the choice and then using the AI to exact their will upon the world, when it becomes beyond a tool, when it becomes the thing that is making the choices, that's when it becomes a problem. That is the main character's argument. That humans, though flawed, should still be in control rather than relinquishing control to the machines and allowing the machines to make these perfectly altruistic choices on our behalves. And it's very clear that that is the way that the main character feels about it, but it never explains why. It never goes into the downsides or the pitfalls of allowing that sort of thing to happen. It was a little strange to me that the far futuristic society where AI has actually taken control and the humans are almost infantilized. They don't make choices on their own. They just sort of live these happy, peaceful, very hippie lives. Very, there's no war, there's no suffering, there's no famine, there's no disease, there's no struggle, there's no money. It's almost like a Star Trek sort of situation, except for there's no exploration to be done because everything's already been discovered. So they don't really have any ambition. They express themselves through dance and art and music, and it's all very much the same. There's not a lot of creative expression because there's not a lot of creative thinking. They don't need to think creatively. The machine has solved all their problems. Human beings are driven towards creative solutions in order to problem solve. And when you remove the problems, we stop creating. And while I feel that that was certainly in there, that was certainly part of the argument of the book, I don't think it was particularly well made. It was very clear that that's what the main character felt, but the why of it, or why you should agree with him or disagree with him, was never really clear. So I wish that that had been articulated a little better. It could be that the book did articulate it and I just missed it. That is possible. But I feel like if you were going to use the novel to make the argument that releasing control of decision-making processes to AI is an inherently bad thing, that the reason it is a bad thing, even though the AI can do all of these good things, remove human suffering, remove disease, remove famine, remove environmental crises, etc., when all of those things are so good, the downside of it, and why it's bad, should be explained more clearly, other than just human beings must suffer in order to problem solve, and problem solving is a creative expression, and loss of creative expression is bad, but it's a trade-off, so sort of the inherent badness of why human beings must suffer and must continue to suffer, and that it's basically arguing that we exist to suffer, and in our suffering we are our best selves. I feel like the goodness that should have been tied to that, or the inherent benefit of that, or the positive outcomes and attributes of that, was not particularly well expressed. So those things are all subjective. Aside from the typos and the editing issues, all of the rest of that is entirely subjective. That was simply my experience when reading that book. Your mileage may vary completely. It is a complex book. There is a lot going on. And because of the bouncing back and forth between time zones, which was done very clearly, you always knew exactly where you were. There was never any question with which characters you were with, or which story, or which timeline you were in. You were never confused about that. But because the book is so complex, different people reading the book will get different things out of it. So what I took away from it may not be what you take away from it, and that's okay. So now that we've talked about some things that I think could have been done a little better, let's talk about some things that I thought were done really well. The book felt tremendously well researched. When I was reading it, the sci-fi elements of it, and it's not particularly prevalent, but the stuff that was sci-fi-y felt really well researched, really thoroughly researched. It all felt plausible. It all felt like things that could actually happen, even though our science isn't there yet. Some of the biotech stuff that he was talking about, you can kind of see where it was grounded in actual reality, like the way that the world actually works. And while we cannot implement those concepts now, it's not unfeasible that we could in the future, given technological development. So I thought that was really interesting, and the way he sort of wove in things that exist in nature that we don't quite understand well enough to harness or use yet. That was really cool, and it felt very grounded in reality. And I find a lot of the time sci-fi books aren't. They're almost approached like fantasy, where it's like, oh, well, I'm gonna make up this really cool thing. It's like, well, how did that happen? It's like, I don't know, sci-fi. Heavy on the fiction. This wasn't heavy on the fiction. This was heavy on the science. And everything sort of felt, even the stuff that was beyond us, felt plausible, and I thought that that was really cool. I know I've already mentioned this, but I just want to bring it up again. I thought that the way that the independent storylines spanning hundreds of years were sort of very slowly, very carefully woven together, and the way that the author did it in such a way that you as the reader were able to weave the story together and start making connections before the story actually showed you the connections and made sure that everybody was all caught up before proceeding. I thought that that was really well done. There was a lot of finesse in the way that that was executed, and it made the book extremely satisfying to read. You genuinely felt a sense of accomplishment when you figured something out, and then the book goes on in the next chapter to actually reveal it. And that's a neat trick to do in any book, but to be able to do it over and over again, chapter after chapter, the way Bringer of Light does it, it's quite an accomplishment. I still don't feel like I've done a great job at explaining what makes this book so special. Yes, the author's mastery of foreshadowing does lend itself to a tremendously rewarding reading experience, but it's more than just that. The big concepts, the big emotional struggles that the book tackles without telling you what to think or how to feel, yes, it does get a little bit soapboxy at times, but again, that was meant to be more of a character. It was clearly meant to be more of a character flaw. It didn't quite read that way, but that was the goal, and it was very obvious that that was the goal. It doesn't tell you what to think, and it doesn't tell you how to feel. It presents the information of, what if this happened? And it lets you draw your own conclusions, and it's not super preachy in that regard. And I thought that that was a really interesting approach. I really appreciated that and the way that it was done. It explored some of the fundamental truths of humanity and, you know, what makes us creative and the things that drive us towards moving forward, drive us towards innovation, drive us towards reaching and becoming more than what we are, and sort of the exploration of the hard truth of we, in general, stop creating when we become comfortable. And really what makes us the very best of what we are the bad things that happen to us, and sort of analyzing why that is and whether or not it truly is worthwhile to solve these problems. To try to solve the problems is of course worthwhile, but to actually solve them, whether or not that does more harm than good. They're all really big concepts to think about, and approaching them and getting your mind to start chewing on those problems without actually telling you what to think, it was a neat trick and part of what made the book so enjoyable for me. I enjoyed it so much I feel like other people should read it. I've already sent a copy out to a friend of mine because I think she would really enjoy it, but I want to give away a copy to you guys too, so all of that information can be found on my website. It's really easy. You just hit the button, and I will never sell or distribute or share your email with anybody. It is just so that I can get in touch with you to let you know that you've won the book. Physical copies can be sent to people in the domestic US, and if you're outside the US, I will send you an ebook copy of it. So yeah, if you're into sci-fi, or even if you're not, and you're just into books that sort of explore the meaning of life and what it means to be human, and how much we can actually give up without becoming something else, if you like those sort of complex thought puzzle processes, it's worth a read. So yeah, definitely pick up a copy of yourself, or if you want to try to win one for free, you can sign up at effywritesbooks.com. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and of course if you like the way that I present information, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell down below. You can find all of my social media contacts in the description, and of course if you want to keep up with me and the progress I'm making on my current novel, you can do that at effywritesbooks.com. Thank you so much for watching, have an excellent day, and I'll see you next time.